it's time that we have a round of questions and some amazing replies where we'll have a very insightful discussion with our resource person for today. But dear participants, before we begin, I would also like to mention that this session will be followed by some interesting questions and answers. So you may post your questions in the Q&A panel that you can see on your screen. As soon as we come towards the end of our interview, we will be taking a few questions as time permits. So, sir, the first question that we have for you today is, how important is reading in the 21st century? And most importantly, are people still reading? Your views on that?
Thank you very much. And can I just start by saying thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here and to talk to you all. So thank you very much for that. So are people still reading? Yes, they are. And I think towards the end of the 20th century, when the internet sort of, became a big thing, there was a feeling that reading would die, that people would stop reading because they could get their information in other ways. But in fact, the reverse has happened. Anne Mangan, who writes a lot about these issues, says that actually there's been an explosion in reading. Because if you think about it, we're forever reading messages on our phones, getting messages through to our computers. And so we're reading more and more. But what has changed perhaps is that we're reading slightly different texts. We're reading new texts that we never encountered until the 21st century in many ways. If you think about text messaging, and we are co-constructing a text as we read, we write, we read, we write, and we're sort of co-constructing it. So the nature of reading has changed, but people are actually reading more and more.
Right, sir. So I think it's very important to also analyze that how in this 21st century, the whole culture of reading is also shifting paradigms. And with this, I would also like you to answer that why is reading important?
Yeah, well, reading is massively important. First of all, I'd say, look, reading for me, reading and writing are just a fantastic human achievement. I mean, an incredible human achievement. You can stay in touch with people thousands of miles apart by clicking a few buttons and reading a message. We can witness history as it was being made by reading eyewitness accounts. Reading is magical. And reading is good for us. Reading is good for us because there's plenty of research that shows that people who report reading a lot also report less loneliness, which is actually obviously good for mental health. So reading is actually good for our mental health. And when we think about second language learning, reading is obviously massively important because just about all models of second language acquisition stress the importance of exposure to the language, of rich input. And reading is a great way of getting that input and exposure to a language. And when you think about the trend across the world, whether we agree with the trend or not, the trend of universities and schools to switch to English medium instruction, at least to some extent, then clearly reading in English, and particularly in English, is massively important because after we have learned to read, we use reading to learn. And if we can't read, then people are going to struggle in all the other subjects. So reading is phenomenally important, I think, massively important.
Absolutely. I mean, what a brilliant comment that it's first important to learn to read, and only then you'll be able to learn by reading and from reading. So, sir, have you discussed some of these strategies in your book, Teaching and Developing Reading Skills? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So the book, Teaching and Developing Reading Skills, is part of the Cambridge Handbooks for Language Teachers series. The series editor is Scott Thornbury. And like most handbooks for teachers, it's very practical. There are about 150, I want to say, about 150 activities in the book that teachers could use with classes. Whenever I love my job, partly I love my job because I get to speak to a lot of teachers. But whenever I speak to teachers, they always tell me, really, they're overworked and underpaid. These are the two things that teachers generally tell me. So the activities are designed to be very simple to use, easy to use. They don't create a lot of extra work for teachers. And we cover how to prepare students for reading text, so before reading activities, how you can move beyond those single correct answers. A lot of what we get in course material, there's a single correct answer, often a multiple choice question or something like that. We also cover reading fluency, teaching reading strategies, the difference between reading a hard copy print book and reading from a screen. So we cover all different aspects of reading. And at the start, what is slightly different about this book is that I did write quite a long essay by handbook standards, not a very long essay, but quite a long essay explaining the research background, because I wanted all the activities to be very evidence-based. I didn't want to just think, oh, that's a nice thing to do with the class. I wanted them to actually be evidence-based and therefore, more chance of working. So that's really what the book covers. It's not a reading course as such. They are activities that you can use, that teachers can use with their existing course material to supplement their course material, or adapt the activities they already have in their course material to their particular needs or whatever. So yeah, that's how the book works.
Right, sir. So very interesting. You have definitely tried to locate the book in a particular context. So with this, sir, I would like to ask that was there a specific incident, or I think any event particularly, that kind of compelled you to write this book and come up with these interesting ideas? If you would like to share that.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. I started teaching a long time ago, I have to say, right? Way back into the last century. But in all that time I've been teaching, the way in which course material has tackled the teaching of reading hasn't really changed at all. If you look at books going back into the 1980s and books that are published now, the texts have changed a little bit, but actually the shape of the lesson is just about the same. And I thought, well, this needs re-examining a little bit. I think this is something that we could maybe improve upon and do a little bit differently. And I'm really wanted to sort of take the research evidence that I was aware of and make that something that teachers could use. So I wanted then to sort of transform that research into practical classroom activities, things that teachers could actually do with their lessons and make sense of it.
Right, sir. Thank you so much for this. But I would also like to know that what things surprised you when you started writing the book? Because as we know that while we write, it is also a process of discovery. So were there particularly a few things that surprised you in the process?
The thing that surprised me most, if I'm honest, was that as I went back to the research and read it again, I already knew it a little bit, but to go back and I obviously reread it and looked at the key sources and so on. And actually researchers on reading, whether we're looking at first language reading or second language reading, research generally agrees. If researchers agree, there's a fairly common picture that emerges. It's not like some areas where you get researchers who sort of take quite different positions on how things happen. For reading, there's a fairly common, clear message that emerges. And that surprised me a little bit. But what disappointed me, and it was also a process of disappointment, I'm afraid, was that when I compared that research to what happens in course books and course material, there was almost no relationship at all. What we were doing in course material didn't really fit what we know from research. So I wanted to try to give people a way to be able to access that insight from research and use things in the book.
Absolutely. So, sir, you found some discrepancy in these things, as we can say.
Yeah.
And with this kind of discovery and with this kind of research, how can teachers best help, especially the beginner level students with reading? Because that's where we see the problem arises. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
the developmental stage.
Yeah. That's a great question. And it's a question I get asked quite a lot about, what about beginners? What about people who are just starting to read, whether it's in their first language or second language? Now, in second language teaching, there's no doubt that if you want to help students become better readers, one thing teachers can do is teach them lots and lots of vocabulary. In the end, students must know the words on the page they're reading. If they don't know the words, they're never going to be able to read it. So they need to be able to build that vocabulary. Building vocabulary is crucial, and recognizing, being able to instantly recognize the word, decode the word, and link it to meaning. So that all the research evidence shows the quicker someone can decode the word and link it to meaning, the better readers they will become. There is a place for phonics, definitely. Sometimes, I don't know what it's like in India, but in the UK, there's often a debate about should there be phonics teaching or more whole language approach. The research evidence is clear. Phonics should be at least a part of teaching reading. But I think also what teachers need to do, and this I think sometimes gets overlooked, teachers also need to try to be a motivator for reading. In the end, reading is like any other skill. The more you do it, the better you will get at it. It's not a secret, really. If you want to be good at something, practice it a lot. And so teachers, I think, need to try at low levels, but really at all levels, probably, to try to be a role model for reading, explain the benefits of reading, and try to motivate their students into doing as much reading as possible.
Right. So, sir, since you mentioned about the importance of vocabulary, how it's very, very crucial to develop that link. First of all, identifying the word and immediately decoding it. So in this whole meaning-making process, as we can call it, what things can teachers do differently to help students with reading?
Yeah, so there are, in terms of that sort of linking meaning to words, the first thing I would say is always teach reading with known vocabulary. The students must know the vocabulary, or at least the majority of the vocabulary. Of course, there may be the odd word they don't know, but there should be that. In order to, the things that I tend to encourage teachers to do a bit differently, first of all, is to do with reading fluency. Now, there's a whole wealth of research evidence on reading fluency, which says that shows very clearly that fluency is linked to accuracy. So as people become more fluent readers, they also become more accurate readers. And yet nearly all the material that we get in course material and so on is focused very much on accuracy. It's very much focused on, can you find the correct answer from the text? So it's very accuracy focused. You could argue that a lot of reading material doesn't really teach reading at all, that it actually tests reading, but it doesn't necessarily help students to get better at reading if they're not good at it in the first place. So we certainly need to try to develop reading fluency. And there are fairly simple activities, including that sort of instant word recognition, practicing vocabulary, recycling vocabulary, that will help with that.
Right. And I also would like to quickly comment on this, since you mentioned about the phonics culture. Even here in the Indian context, we do see different viewpoints and opinions whether phonics should be integrated, whether it should not be integrated, and at which point, at which level it should be introduced. So we also sometimes have those lessons creeping in the postgraduate syllabus and the undergraduate syllabus, so that
Right.
students, right, can re-emphasize on the pronunciation. So when you think about speaking, I think we all know how it is integrated and enmeshed with listening. So, do you feel, sir, there is some connection with the way we have listening and reading integrated? You also have some connection with listening and reading, because thereby my next question, that how is it that critical reading is so important these days, and is it really connected with all the other skills, and what exactly is critical reading?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. What exactly is critical reading? Just as we sometimes talk about critical thinking, critical reading, sometimes there's not much of a definition, or different people use slightly different definitions, and that can make research studies and stuff quite hard to compare if people are not using the same definition of things. I think critical reading has always been important. Of course, it's always been important, but I think in the 21st century, it's more important than ever, because we are getting more and more information from screens, because we're getting it from the internet and people can self-publish. People clearly need to be able to separate fact from opinion, and also to fact check. And these are skills that we probably need to teach our students. So a very simple sort of thing that I often do with my students is, when I give them a text to read, if it's an opinion-based text, something from a newspaper or something like that, just get them to Google, to search for the author, the publisher. When someone is saying they're an expert, are they really an expert? You know, can you tell whether they're an expert? What about the publication? Does the publication have a bias towards one sort of point of view or another? So try to get students to sort of investigate what they are reading. And I get them to do things like, I don't know, underline facts in one color, or highlight in one color, underline opinion in a different color. So we're trying to sort of write what is fact-based, what is opinion-based, which I think are really important skills for students to develop.
Right, sir. So then in that case, do you see any further scope for research to flourish in this area?
Yes, that's a good question. Now, there are a couple of things that I would really like, if I have time to do the research myself, or maybe other people to do it. One is about extensive reading. Most reading that you see in classrooms is what would be termed intensive reading, relatively short texts that are relatively difficult, that are studied quite carefully. Extensive reading is about reading large quantities of text that are relatively easy for the students. They know virtually all the words in them, usually without much assessment or anything like that. And the research evidence on extensive reading is very good. It improves reading, it improves writing, it improves grammar, it improves vocabulary. It's great. And yet, no one does it, really. Not many people do it. And even where there is an extensive reading program offered in some universities and so on, and even built into courses sometimes, students seem to do the minimum that they can do. Now, I have got a student doing her PhD who is going to look at interventions for trying to boost extensive reading. So how can we improve the uptake of extensive reading? Now, my theory, my hunch, not theory, my guess is that the problem is that people who advocate extensive reading believe that people read for pleasure, that reading is its own reward. All they will do, you know, once we introduce people to reading, they'll just want to do it. I don't know that's true, and I don't know it's true in a second language. I'm trying to learn Spanish, and I do read in Spanish because I know it's good for me. I don't, it's still hard work. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a pleasure to do it. So I think we need to, for example, explain the benefits to students. You know, what they will get out of doing the extensive reading. And it's not painful, at least. It may not be pleasure, but it's not painful. So I think one thing, how can we improve the uptake of extensive reading? That would be a really useful piece of research, because we assume that extensive reading would work. The other thing, if I've very, very briefly, is to talk about a fluency-based piece of research. In the UK, a researcher called Joanna Westbrook at Sussex University and her colleagues was in first language reading. They took texts. The students had a book, essentially a book, but the teacher read the book to the students and read quite rapidly. They didn't stop a lot. They didn't test comprehension an awful lot. They sometimes checked that students were following. And the results Westbrook and her colleagues had were sensational at improving particularly weak readers. Just that process of listening to a fluent reader read the text to the student. Now, that was for first language reading, but most research that works for first language reading, most things that work for first language reading also work for second language reading. So I would love to try to replicate that research, more or less steal her methodology completely, but apply it to second language learning, because there is quite a strong potential that we might find that was a really useful intervention for students, particularly weak readers.
Interesting. Very interesting, sir. I think we can just go on and on with this interview because we have so many questions. But again, the Q&A is getting an overwhelming response, sir. So we would also like to take a few questions from the questions posed by our participants. And before we begin with that, my final question to you is, can you describe one or two activities from your book that teachers could use with their classes?
Yes, I would be great to hear the questions from the other people. I'm sorry if I've spoken too long. I'll just describe one very quickly. Something I do, and it's based on Joanna Westbrook's research, actually. After students have read a text once, so they've read the text, they answer the questions, there's probably multiple choice questions, that sort of thing, the students read it. In my experience of watching lessons, what teachers then do is usually sigh of relief, the reading bit's over, now we can do something more interesting, and the lesson moves on. But actually, I think text should be exploited a bit more. And simply reading that text to students, reading it quickly to students. So they've got it in front of them and the teacher reads it and the students follow it. The students just follow it, but the teacher just reads it a little bit quicker than the students would feel comfortable with. That will improve. That activity has been tested over and over again, and it improves reading fluency, not just of the text that you are reading, but of future texts as well. It improves reading fluency, and reading fluency improves reading accuracy. So it's a very simple technique. Any teacher can do it. They just have to read a little bit quicker than their students can. That's all their teacher has to do. No new material, no preparation. Just use that activity. Obviously, you won't see a huge benefit if you do it one time and never again. But if you build it into your teaching over 2 or 3, a couple of times a week or something, it only needs to be for a few minutes. That will improve reading fluency, which will help students. I'll stop there because it would be nice to hear the other questions. So I'm sorry if I've gone on and on and on. The trouble is, if you ask me about reading, I may never start. I'll just keep talking and talking until you should mute me or something.
No, not at all, sir. It's in fact very interesting, insightful, and it's actually related to what you were just talking about. So the first question that we are taking from our participants is about the book itself. So Siddhi asks, reading fiction and reading for academic purposes requires different strategies. So first of all, sir, do you agree? And does the book address this?
Yeah, first of all, it's a good point. Most research, particularly reading from a screen, comparing screen reading and print reading, if you read fiction, there's no difference in comprehension. But if you compare factual texts, we tend to understand more when we read a hard copy as opposed to read from a screen. Now, no one is quite sure why that is, but several studies have shown it. It's probably because factual texts are more densely, lexically dense, so there's more sort of content words in them. Also I think factual writing, academic writing in particular, I don't know if the question was particularly about academic writing, you can get quite long sentences, complex sentences with subordinate clauses all linked to each other. And it can be very difficult for students to trace the link. So they lose the sort of, there's a pronoun, but it's not clear to them where the pronoun goes and that sort of thing, what it links to. So there are activities in the book that actually focus on following that as a piece of discourse. And there is a separate chapter, I forgot to mention it earlier, there is a separate chapter on using fiction with students as well.
That's
using
great, sir.
literature. I think it's called using literature, but it's essentially fiction.
Okay. So the next question is, for readers in a second language, should students focus on sight words or high frequency words? This comes from Michelle.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, I think always, if we want to help students, we need to focus on vocabulary. Frequent words, it makes a lot of sense to read, to do first. And there are some words, you asked me earlier about beginner students, that there are some words in English, because of the nature of English, where phonics decoding won't work very well. So you have to have a whole word decoding, because if you just take a word like two, as in the number two, TWO, there's no way from a phonics approach you can work that out, because you'd come up to twat or so, it doesn't sound like two. So in English in particular, there are a few words, and some of them are very common words like because, to, that you actually need to just say the shape of the word, recognize the shape of the word, if possible.
Undoubtedly, English is a funny language for quite a lot of us. Right. So here we have the next question from Siva, who asks that teachers should definitely motivate students for reading. So as far as the level of students is concerned, are there any specific ideas, or is there any ideal method for teaching secondary level students as far as English as a second language is concerned?
So for secondary level students, it obviously depends on the level of the student. I would say giving students a choice of what they read helps. So if you want to get students to read outside the classroom, giving them a range of texts to read, so that their readings, they have some autonomy over it. Autonomy is usually linked to motivation, so they may be a bit more motivated to do it. Anything that will motivate the students into doing more reading is obviously going to be hugely beneficial. And I think that it's really important that the teacher also tries to be a role model for reading. So perhaps experience their own, relate their own experience of reading in a second language and how it's benefited them and those sorts of things. So that would be my advice, but it does depend a little bit on what level of English proficiency the students are. I'm afraid I'm not exactly familiar with secondary school, or which country that was from or whatever. So sure.
Yeah, I think it's from India, and
Okay.
Here the secondary level can be probably interpreted as high school students.
Okay.
Yeah.
So probably those things that I was talking about yes, it's still important to teach vocabulary, but also reading fluency, extensive reading where possible, outside the classroom would be really useful.
Very interesting, sir. You just mentioned about knowing a little bit other factors that really influence on the students' comprehension skills. And with this, there's the other question that is very much connected from Sankal, who asks, knowing the student's socioeconomic and academic background, how a teacher should encourage the students to read to help enhance their language proficiency? Is there a connection between these two factors?
The factors of language proficiency and encouraging them to read, was it?
And if you really know the student's socioeconomic background, or even the academic skills if the student is maybe at the undergraduate level or postgraduate level. So then can you really work by, the combination of the factors and helping the student improve his or her language proficiency?
Yeah, I think one of the things, the research evidence is pretty clear that reading will benefit language proficiency overall, not just reading. So the extensive research on extensive reading shows that grammar improves, vocabulary expands, but also the quality of vocabulary knowledge improves. So reading will benefit language development of grammar, of writing, of vocabulary. So we need to get students to read. Now, in terms of the background and identity of the students, that's a really important point. And one of the factors that probably inhibits extensive reading, and particularly reading outside the classroom, is that it can be expensive to get the resources. It can be expensive to get them. However, there are some free resources available. So as long as somebody has an internet connection, and I know not everybody might have an internet connection, but if the school or university or whatever can provide an internet connection, then there are free reading resources available for people through there's one called sort of readtheory.org, for example, and the students get tested in the first instance. So it's free, they go on, they get tested, and then the software provides them a text to read, and when they've read it, they get another one and another one and another one, and the text they get supplied are linked to their level that they did. Now, it is an American organization based in the United States. So culturally, you know, I assume, I'm not sure, I assume it's biased towards the United States. But I think the texts are fairly culturally neutral. They're not going to cause offense to people, I don't believe. They've been selected so they're not going to offend people or upset people or anything like that. So that sort of thing would be really useful.
Thank you so much, sir. Another interesting question that we have from Siddhi is, can reading the scripts written in one's native language be a strategy for improving English reading skills, assuming that English is the second or the foreign language?
Oh, what a great question. Yes. In fact, it's one of the differences between learning to read. There's a lot of similarity between reading in the first language and a second language, a lot of similarity. But one of the differences, of course, is that you've already got an understanding of how text works when you come to read a second language. So if you're already reading in your first language, you've got some idea of how reading works. Now, the advantage that you will get will be linked slightly to, well, not slightly, it will be linked to how close the first language is to English. Assuming English is the second language, how close is the first language to that? So if syntactically it's similar, that will be a help. Obviously, if the script is the same, you know, a student from an Arabic country has to learn an Arabic speaking country has to learn a whole new script, or a Chinese student has to learn a whole new script. So the separation between the languages is important. So the closer the languages, the bigger the impact and support the first language gives.
Absolutely. And we really can probably get some very different insights as far as even comparing languages and cultures and literatures are concerned, right? So, so we all know that with digitization, we have moved and got more inclined towards an image-based text, or I think the culture of audiobooks that's mushrooming. So nowadays, students are really finding it very, very difficult to read, particularly if they have an alternative video or audio available for the same text. So as teachers, how do we bring them back to books?
How do we get students to want to read? It's tough. It really is tough. I think if we sort of give them a traditional book and a sort of a literature-based thing, like here's, I don't know, a book of Charles Dickens or something. Most, oh, like really? I think one of the things we have to do is trying to get students to read the kinds of texts they're interested in and are actually using. So in the book, Teaching and Developing Reading Skills, some of the activities are based around sort of WhatsApp type messages, so conversations and so on. So because that is reading, we're still reading those things. So some of the activities are based around that. So I think one of the secrets, I would say, is we need to take a broad view of text and not get too upset if students don't choose to read something we might like them to read. All reading is good reading. Try to find out texts that they're actually interested in would probably be my advice.
Right. Thanks for that great suggestion, sir. Now, the next question comes from Anne, who, again, on the similar line, tries to ask this question, that what is your opinion of using bilingual picture books at any age to support fluency and comprehension?
Yeah, I think it's good. Because, particularly, I'm looking at it from a second language teaching perspective. As I said before, students need to know what words mean. We need to teach from the known, reading from what is already known. And I guess pictures obviously support understanding. If you think reading in your first language, kids' books always have pictures, right? They're there to support understanding. And when we write materials, we need to select images that actually support understanding, and we probably need to help our students to read the picture, as it were, and pick up as much meaning as they can from the pictures. So there's that. But also, if reading a text in your own language first will no doubt help you understand another text. It's a way of grading the text in a way. The English text, if English is the second language here, reading the English text on its own might be way too difficult. If you've read it in your first language first and you kind of know what's happening in that text, then it will obviously make it much, much easier. And so it's a way of grading the text.
Definitely, sir. So the next question, which is again a very pointed question, comes from Apsara, who asks, can we focus more on reading for pleasure than understanding?
Yes, so extensive reading would absolutely focus on that. Extensive reading would say, look, you read something which is easy for you. It's a bit of a lot of teachers and even more students, I think, believe that unless it's difficult, it won't do you any good. It has to be difficult. It doesn't actually have to be difficult. There is a balance, and some easy reading and reading for pleasure, and just read the book. There won't be a big test afterwards. It's not, there's not going to be that sort of, oh, have I got 8 out of 10 or 9? No, you just read for pleasure. That will be a good thing. It really will. I would advocate that completely. But of course, students do have to understand. And that comes about by using texts that are relatively easy for them. So we need to get students to read texts, hopefully for themselves, that are easy. One of the things I get my students to do, if they've got a little graded reader or something, open the book to any page and count 100 words. Just count 100 words, and then look at those 100 words and look at how many they don't know. Okay. If they don't know more than 3 or 4 of those words out of the 100, it's probably too difficult for them. They should be picking books that have got 2 or 3 unknown words, not 10, 15 unknown words. That will just become a pain. That will just become, oh, I've got to get my phone out and look at, translate that word, translate this word. Who's going to enjoy that? We need to get students outside of class to sometimes read things that are relatively easy, and they can do that little test for themselves. How many unknown words? If it's a lot, stop, go back, find something easier.
Pretty interesting. So finally, a very general question, because it's all about the practical English language teaching aspect. Here we have this question where we would like to know that what are the major obstacles to run ELT in our classrooms? And what measures can be taken as solutions for having an ELT-based classroom?
Wow, what a question. I think the barriers will always be context specific. So, the things that make it difficult in one situation with one group of learners, maybe age, maybe country, will be different. I think what we need to do, though, is try to focus on getting students to communicate and focus things as much as possible on communication and communicating about things that students are actually interested in. So, for young kids, it may be storybooks and stuff like that, because kids tend to like stories. They like stories about all kinds of characters and whatever. Focus on things that are interesting and try to focus on things that getting students to communicate about things, react to things, give their opinions about things, using the language as a means for doing it. We can still worry about grammar and different things, but we can sometimes just teach the grammar the students need as they try to communicate. So when they try and tell us what they did at the weekend and they don't get the past tense right, okay, we can step in and try to teach a little bit on the past tense. But we can start with, but what do you want to tell me about the weekend? Tell me about the weekend. Start with communication wherever possible would be my advice.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. And we can see our participants are really enjoying this session. We can go on and on and on, but of course, due to paucity of time, we'll have the final question. Actually, a lot of our participants have asked this, so I would just like to club them because they are similar in nature. Our friends are worried that when it comes to students reading, the length of the text is a challenge. So a lot of students complain about the length of the text, and they somehow don't have the patience to sit and read longer texts. So, sir, any advice on that? And what is your take?
Well, it's a good question. And again, it comes back to this idea of what we're asking students to do is probably really at the limit of what they can cope with. And it does get frustrating if it's difficult and it's long and it seems like it will never end. You asked me just a moment ago about what about bilingual books? Well, actually, that is a way of making difficult long texts easier. If the students read a summary, for example, in their own language, that may help. In a way, supporting learners more, preparing learners more for the reading. Sometimes my students at university sometimes have to read texts and I think this is going to be, they're never going to do it. Really, do they have to do it? And sometimes I'll more or less talk them through it and tell them what it's about bit by bit. And then they go away and read it. The more preparation you can give, obviously that may include teaching some vocabulary before students read. Giving a summary of meaning, breaking it into parts perhaps. So rather than letting someone start at the beginning, get to the end and then realize they understood nothing really or very little, maybe breaking it up into sections, checking understanding, because all reading is about taking new information that you're getting from the text and fitting it into what you already know. But if you don't know what happened before, you can't fit new information into that. So checking students have understood maybe after each section, that sort of thing will help. But of course, there is no easy way of doing it. It comes back in the end, developing those reading skills, developing vocabulary, developing fluent reading that will help students in the end be able to cope with those very difficult texts.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Professor Watkins. You've actually given us a summary of all the points that we have covered throughout this interesting discussion. But to give you a quick glance and give our friends and participants a quick glance on the takeaways that we have had in this discussion is, I would like to say that Sir has given us insights related to how reading is magical and how reading helps improve mental health. So we have also discovered strategies related to learning to read and how we can read to learn. So text definitely has changed, but the shape of the lesson has remained the same. So therein comes Professor Watkins' research, where he has talked about reading fluency, accuracy, critical reading, extensive and intensive reading, and reading for pleasure, or reading for education. So we have also had very interesting points related to the first language and the second language context and the reading skills that can be developed. So thank you so much. And thank you so much, Professor, for this very interesting and insightful discussion that we have just had. I would also like to place on record my sincere thanks to the organizers of this session and having Sir on board, because we have thoroughly enjoyed some very amazing insights in this session.